Welcome back to another episode of Differentiate Understanding. I'm your host, Grace Xiao. As many of you know, I also write the industry newsletter AI Proem on Substack, so please do give that a follow. I'm very excited for today's guest. For those of you who follow the open source AI space closely, Nathan Lambert needs little introduction. Nathan is a machine learning researcher focused on building, understanding, and advocating for open language models and responsible autonomous systems. He was a post-training lead at the Allen Institute for AI and has also worked at Hugging Face, DeepMind, and Facebook AI. He is also the author of the newsletter Interconnects. Nathan recently came back from a trip to China where he met many of the leading AI labs and researchers across the ecosystem. His reflections were some of the most thoughtful pieces I've read on Chinese AI, not just because they cover model capabilities, but because they capture the culture, incentives, and organizational differences behind how these models are being built. His piece also gets at a bigger question I keep coming back to. Are we really looking at one global AI race? Or are the US and China starting to optimize around very different ecosystems? Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to finally hear about your thoughts on your big China trip, on what's happening between the China AI labs and the US AI labs, what you think of the potential compute constraint might mean for these labs and their performance in the future, and obviously the open source ecosystem. So before we get into all of that, could you briefly tell us about how you ended up actually working on post-training and open language models? Just a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I actually started my PhD at Berkeley in 2017, not working on AI things. I was an electrical engineer by training in undergrad, which is funny looking back because that's the same year that the Transformer paper came out. And I was like, I think I should do this AI thing, and tried to get the famous advisors to mentor me. And they're like, we can't take you. So I had my PhD as this wandering path to become in AI. And then I ended up at Hugging Face after that, which was it was like realistically the only industry research job that I had, but also a very hot startup and very fun to learn kind of at the intersection of these tools that people use a lot for AI and research is what I was doing. And then when ChatGPT hit, the kind of RLHF thing blew up as the hot word on the technical side of things. My PhD had ended up being in reinforcement learning, which is this the first half of reinforcement learning from human feedback. So it's kind of a natural pivot to be like, well, I might just do that. And Hugging Face was a good place for doing that because the whole company is kind of all for that, which is figure out how to support the community on the hot thing and build platforms there. So they were very happy about that. And I helped build a team at Hugging Face. And then I was kind of burnt on the remote work time zone thing and found out that the Allen Institute was doing such similar stuff. And I was like, wow, I have people that could be in-person friends and do similar things. I was like, quality of life, I need to do this. And a few years later, I ended up building a bunch of models, and I think the being in a nonprofit kind of opened to this ecosystem vacuum of information where there aren't many people I can talk about what they're doing. So then with some luck and committing to write every week, I just feel like my influence just filled the vacuum of nobody saying reasonable things. And it's this nice synergy between what I write about and what I work on in my day job. And it just kind of got bigger and bigger in a very fun way. And I think that generally at the highest level, I'm motivated by wanting AI to go well on this trajectory. And I worry about a lot of near-term things, whether it's social unrest in the US and just kind of the massive hatred for AI, I think is a very big near-term problem. And then medium-term, more concentration of power, because I think AI will be super powerful in ways that people don't expect. So generally open models is a nice way to curb on both of them by being a bit more transparent to people. And it naturally is a hedge against concentration of power. And there's been different reasons throughout that, but that's kind of a recurring theme in my life in the last few years.
Definitely. And I love your work because I think you help, non-technical people like myself really understand what's behind what's happening in these labs a lot better. And then I actually just spoke to your former colleague, Tiejun Wang, he was with APAC Hugging Face just last week. And he was saying the same thing. It's just open source in many ways is kind of the best way to go forward, as we know that this technology will not stop in evolution, but it's the best way to kind of put up guardrails and check and balances for the monopolies. Okay, I don't want to take up too much time on that side of things today because our focus really is about your China trip. So before we get into the weeds of it all, I want to hear about your trip yourself. Most people who are writing about Chinese AI is they're getting their information secondhand. You really went there. You spent time with the researchers. You met with people who are building the models. Tell us about what you meant when you said, okay, you kind of came back with great humility, right? Like your eyes were a bit more open, whether it's the good or the bad. Like tell us about your trip.
I feel like I kind of went in. I mean, I had this horrible English phrase in my writing, which was like I knew nothing about China, which is like kind of trying to indicate that I knew going into the trip that I knew nothing, and it was still the fact in my current writing. This is like a horribly written sentence that I had in there, and I only talk about it because somebody called me out on it. It's like, what is this? And it's like leaving, but just knowing that it's such a big country and there are just like such vast amounts of talent working on these problems, and how unpredictable it is as a human to model people with very different worldviews and upbringings and training systems. Realistically, like the way that people are trained in China is very different, and I just think that even being there, you can't fully grasp just like what are the pockets of 3 to 6 researchers doing that is actually a bit different than in the West, even if they're working on the same goal. Like I think you could get down to that level of granularity in a sociological study and actually like see differences in what they're working on, and that'll always change the output. And it's like, I didn't get to that level of granularity, but it's just to start having real experiences and understanding how people explain how they work on these problems. And for me, realistically, a lot of it is coalition building, which is just like, I want there to not be vitriol at the level of the technical companies doing things in international bodies. So just like meeting all the labs on both sides is really nice, because you need to do that for them to get to talk to you about more sensitive issues in the future. So some people, I got some criticism on this on the piece, which is like, this is how you shouldn't visit China. And it's like, what else are you going to do if you're going on an official visit to a bunch of companies? It's like, how do you expect to get in the door without being nice? It's like, you have to start somewhere. And I think that it's important to be respectful.
The piece was frankly like, I don't think I don't think the criticism was like fair, to be honest, because like I think you were really transparent with the fact you're not a China person, right? It's not like you're like going there and exoticizing everything. And if anything, a lot of people, even with China background, like to use certain dragons and, tigers to describe things. I feel like you actually were really humble going and be like, I'm just a technical dude meeting with these labs, talking about their technical research, right? And then because you were physically there, you had observations of the culture and the people. So yeah, I actually thought your piece was quite good. And not, yeah,
I
sorry.
agree. I was willing to, I let that sail past. But I think it's important for people that listen to realize how actively these companies are trying to court Western audiences, which is why we could get in the door. I mean, like we had some prominent people on this trip, but that's why we got all of them in the days that we wanted them,
How did you get everyone?
DeepSeek. So essentially,
how did you get everyone?
Some like Catherine Rentel, who works with me at Interconnects, and some other creators, he used to live in China and has connections in China. So he kind of orchestrated the mix of his connections and leveraging like my connections to labs. And so like we had some bigger names on the trip as well. Just like stringing all of these together to get all the various labs in place is like a few months of networking to make sure the trip lines up with people with established networks and contacts with the various labs. But like these people want to look good to Western audiences, so they're going to only say yes to the right researchers. And the researchers know that there's 2 to 4 comm/ops people in the room hanging out, making sure that it goes well. Like, especially the bigger the company, the more their comms people. It's like you go to Alibaba and there's 3 to 5 various people, from the head of comms to some special offices. And it's like, you're not going to get these people in the office or at all without accepting the cost of these types of handlers. It's the same thing in the US. It's like, you're not going to just plop a senior executive into a chair. It's
of course.
So it's also like good because now I have WeChat of a bunch of researchers from China that I could just text about things. It's like, hey, congrats on the new model release. It's like Lei Li works at Xiaomi Mimo. It's like, talk to this guy for an hour at a mall at like I don't remember the name of the tea store, but it's like, now we have these relationships, which is very useful. And that helps information spread across the ecosystem to these trusted parties, which doesn't really exist. There's not that many. I think and the opposite direction of the trip is very hard because Chinese researchers can't really enter the US. The visa purgatory is too complicated, where a lot of us on the trip were either Canadian or enter on a transit without a visa entry, which makes it very easy for American technical talent to go to China right now, which is why I think there's so many trips. I think there'll be more of them. So we've got a lot of inbound from VCs and like open source labs in the US that want to establish collaborations with these various labs because they're the best open weight models, and they want to build a stack for companies in the US building open weight models. So I think there's going to be more prominent but not gigantic US startups going to try to build these relationships, which I think is a really interesting technological development because we've never seen this type of pro work trip in China from US tech companies. So like most of the tech companies have you bring a device to China, it auto bricks itself and you have to hand it into IT. So to like actually proactively send people in a professional capacity is a really big change. And I kind of like there's a lot of angles to take this, but I think it's cool to see how it unfolds. This isn't even really about the trip. This is like follow on that we're hearing from people that are like, hey, how'd you do this? We want to do this trip.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, from my end, I hear about I think VCs or investors have always been quite active going to China because obviously previously American funds were very, very active in China during the internet era. And then people were kind of always trying to find a way to either get into these good deals or potentially keep it, their pulse on it. But I think it's really, really positive for the whole AI ecosystem to have this kind of, I guess fair, transparent, exchange in some capacity. But to your point, there's no way that this star researchers can come out and talk to off the record without any compliance, because that doesn't happen in the US either. That's just companies protecting themselves. I just think your trip was quite meaningful. And I want to bring it back to your observations, actually. You talked a lot about, the cultural aspects of it. You talked about how you felt like in China, there was less of this star researcher of celebrity status around people. People were more either humble or there's more humility. It was very focused on execution. You argue that Chinese labs are particularly well suited to the current LM building game because they were very focused on meticulous stack level work. And there's less ego sometimes to work on kind of the dirty work or, the non-sexy work. So kind of unpack that for us. Why do you think that is? You kind of touched on it. You said they were brought up differently. They were taught differently. But what's so different?
So essentially, the interesting part of that synergizes on this trip is we stopped by some academic institutions, I think it's AIR in Tsinghua and stuff, and you hear all of these academic leadership talk about how they're pushing hard to try to change it. So China, yes, they know China is producing more papers than anything else, but they still think that it's not as transformative of research. And they think that they're trying to cultivate the academic domestic ecosystem to change just the type of work it works on and the distribution and take more risk. And then you would talk to some industry leaders off the record behind closed doors, and you would hear things like, oh, it's never going to change because the education system is so structured and there are so many layers of the funnel that reward things like memorization and stuff that they're just this research culture is not going to emerge. And then the kind of follow on is with the AI labs crossover is that these labs are doing fast following and they're kind of as a proof of concept and they know what it needs to look like. And therefore in that domain, you're not trying to invent the new paradigm. You're not trying to make the model that is O1 or O3 or the first model to work in Claude Code. I see it and I'm going to try to do that and make it the best thing. And it's going to be try to make it cheaper and just maximize that goal. And I don't think that a lot of companies don't need to invent the new paradigm. OpenAI has done this so many times. That's their bread and butter is just never doubt OpenAI's ability to release a blog post and a plot that changes how people think about AI. I still think it's going to happen a few times in this massive boom over the next 4 years. It's OpenAI just kind of has that sense of what is the thing that you can push on a bit earlier and just transform things. But I don't expect, and other people wouldn't expect the Chinese companies to do that as much because it's just such a culture of, I guess that's I don't know how to describe the positive version of this as a culture of building, but it's just maybe slightly more practical minded in terms of just it's your job to build this thing. A lot of the researchers, maybe because they knew their managers, some of them had managers in the room or so on, but it's just they see their role in the company as being to make the models excellent. And especially for students, I work with students and that's what they say. I work at the Allen Institute and we have students that will co-lead our language models. And it's not that surprising because if you do an industry research job in the US, a lot of mentors will tell you that you're kind of free of the burden of bureaucracy and politics. So it's the naivety of students and the simple-mindedness is actually so good at just getting a lot of technical work done. And there's also the life side. If you don't have, you're younger, you don't have as much family, you normally haven't built up as many habits and other things you do with your life. So it's just language models are so complex in the amount of context that you need to absorb to understand what the bottleneck is. So there's just so much information and you have to be able to pick what the bottleneck is and break it. And if you just don't have the mental space to absorb all the context, you kind of end up doing things that are cute, but don't make breakthroughs on the model. So that's kind of a difference that I've seen in people who are both very successful academically before language models, like some of them are able to pivot to this practical mind, which is just like, what is the state of the system? How do I improve it? And then some try to make kind of these abstract frames of what's happening and approach it like an academic, and it normally doesn't improve the model as much. So I just kind of see like if the academic system is a bit more practical minded, a bit more like structured, and the work you're doing is structured in the language model, which is like make this kernel implementation faster, make this idea work, then maybe it can be. I think it's an oversimplification. I push on that a bit in the piece just to really contrast like what you could think a US lab will look like. And I have a few anecdotes. Like I've heard a US lab paying off a researcher to be quiet about their thing not being in the model. Like all of these one-off things are more storytelling devices than anything, because like most one-off things don't matter at all. But also Llama 4 imploded, and like that was because it was described as a Game of Thrones political style environment with all of the VPs vying for influence on showing that their thing made the benchmarks go up, and it kind of fell. Like many people will tell you that. And we've had the Quen turnover, but it doesn't seem like it was quite the same type of thing as Llama 4, or like XAI barely exists now. Like there's been some dramatic things in the US with how these companies have kind of come and gone out of the fold.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, but also I would push back on, I think, there's obviously a more rigid and competitive academic system, which kind of by default in East Asia, I think result in a culture of students following the bureaucracy and authority a bit more. And so I agree with you in the sense like they're very pragmatic. They focus on what the task that is given to them is. However, I wonder if things will change with how AI will disrupt education. That's number one, but also how like a lot of the young researchers that, you're working with today, they seem quite different. At least a lot of the, entrepreneurs I meet today, they are born in the 80s and 90s, some even are younger and born in the 2000s. And I think there's a kind of an aura or confidence coming from them. If anything, you want to say they're a bit more individualistically minded. People in the street, you went to Shanghai, right? Like people are dressed very, very uniquely. They have like these outrageous outfits on the streets. People are seeking individual ways to kind of showcase their personality. So I wonder if that will shift. But for sure, for the academic institution like the Tsinghuas and the Beidas of the world, they are still very old school. But I would say that is the same maybe in even some academic institutions in the West still. Okay, I think we kind of, this topic, we can go off in a tangent.
Yeah, you
on
could take that in
academics.
so many tangents.
But let's go back to China's ecosystem. So when DeepSeek V4 came out, we talked about it offline, the two of us, quickly, about a piece I wrote saying how, DeepSeek is starting to look a bit more like a base layer for China. And if anything, some of the labs kind of admitted to that. They're like, we have very limited resources. And to your point earlier, limited people, the labs are tiny. They're run by like 100 to 200 people max, limited capital, obviously limited compute. They have constraints all around. And in that sense, in a way, ecosystems looking more like kind of like less of a zero sum game, but more like different players optimizing their own strengths. So correct me if I'm wrong, but DeepSeek is providing a base layer where a lot of labs will quickly follow and basically adopt a lot of their engineering breakthroughs. And then Z.ai, they will kind of focus on the coding, MiniMax focusing on the multimodality, etc. Right? There's a lot of these different players. ByteDance obviously very, very focused on their video models, and Quinn, like you mentioned, they had the whole open source saga break apart with Lin Junyang leaving, but in general, they're still kind of the leader in hyperscalers on that front, right? So everyone's doing their own thing almost, instead of
I agree with the
really
people specializing, which I think is normal business evolution, which is you figure out a bit what you're good at. And there's so much opportunity that they are like, okay, I'll follow this because they see that they're good at it. I just am more skeptical of DeepSeek as a base, because I'm like, I have no idea what DeepSeek is doing. And some of the labs when we were there, because DeepSeek V4 had just come out, were like, yeah, we look at the things they're doing, but they seem more intricate than needed. And that's kind of like, if you read the paper, it's like, there's just so much going on in this model. And as a researcher, I'm like some of it seems a little fake or a little dependent on their setup and not necessarily going to work in
what does
every
that mean?
model. It's
Break
like
it down for me.
essentially, I will say that like building an LLM is like path dependent, where you have your GPUs, you have your pre-trained data set, you have your intended deployment stats and stuff like this. So you make decisions based on your constraints and you build the model. So like DeepSeek has these constraints and they end up with their model, but Moonshot and Jipu have different constraints, maybe more flexibility, and they end up building a different model. And they will test the DeepSeek innovations, and so they'll say things like, "Oh, X innovation doesn't improve our model." And it's just like these two organizations are on different development paths that have core similarities, like these large mixture of expert models, and the general methods are similar, but a lot of the parts end up being a bit different. And that's why I'm like, I don't know exactly if DeepSeek was a base, you would see the Chinese labs like, we just do post training. We just take the base model that's out there and we adapt it to our domain of specialty, and we have users that do that, which is something that I think about a lot. I mean, like I'm thinking about starting a post training lab as like, and like how to format post training research better. Like, so I think about this a lot. So I think about what a shared base actually would be. And they go through, they like some of these labs put an extreme cost on creating their base model. And if they didn't need to do that, they wouldn't. So essentially, like one of the labs told us how long their pre-training run was. And I was like, jaw dropped. I was like, that's way too long. Like any US company, an advisor would be like, you're taking way too much risk on this pre-training run. It's like if they didn't land that pre-training run from one of these past big MOEs at a Chinese lab, I'd be like, I don't know if the company's dead, but that's like like a huge amount of time. And most of the US companies now know it's like you don't want your big pre-training run to be more than a few months because it's just so much risk and time to put all your eggs in that basket. So I think there's like, that's a sign of, in that case, it's just like they don't have as big of a like a peak size cluster. Like essentially you need pre-training time can come down a lot when you have a bigger overall cluster. You can just get more throughput on it. But if your biggest cluster is smaller, it's harder to get a certain amount of throughput, but you use that one for longer. So like that's a compute constraint. But to kind of loop it back, I just like, I think the specialization is real, but I'm more like, I have no idea what DeepSeek is doing. I know they're raising money now. Like, I don't know what the plan is there.
No one knows. No one knows.
They seem the most like without a specialty in the Chinese ecosystem.
That's my point, right? I feel like they've been kind of nationalized, whether willingly or not, because they're taking the Chinese government's money, you know, kind of gone secretive. It's not like there's a secret that they prefer Chinese, you know, educated researchers. They're keeping it very domestic, even from talent to capital to the whole stack. So to me, it seems like they're being Huawei, you know, in some ways, because they did well and they got their name globally, and then by default they're becoming the next Huawei, willingly or not.
I don't think nationalization makes you a base for the other companies, at least not at this stage. Like there could be something,
but then you have some
incentive,
right? But then there's some incentive. You're like, well, if you can propel, or you can take one of a team and propel the whole industry as a whole, it could be in your KPI or some kind of
the coordination problem is so hard. So essentially, both in the US and China, this even the open labs, what they do is that they fork open source code and then they match it to their internals. And every company does this. And it's just like, therefore, all the improvements that could potentially be going to the open code and like forming this base that is far more efficient, like they're not completing the feedback loop. And I think China could be closer to it. Like if people really leaned in as DeepSeek as a standard architecture and DeepSeek shared their training code and all the specifics and how to do this, like I think from a Chinese economic perspective, like that would be a huge win because you're just saving gating compute multipliers. But I think it's just like too decentralized and too competitive to have that happen. I mean, it's like it wouldn't happen in the US either. Even though I think for open models to be closer to the frontier, it would be better. It's just like I talk about open models in the US needing a consortium, but it's like how like there's definitely enough money to make a consortium in the US, but then like you just fail because the model won't be good because you're feeding too many asks on the model. Even though that's like the only way to create a shared base. Yeah.
It's not a commercial reason. Okay, so if you had to like, I don't know, give a high level commentary on each of the major labs, what would it be? Like if you look at ByteDance, Baba, Tencent, Hunyuan, if they're relevant, you think DeepSeek, Moonshot, Zhipu, MiniMax, Meituan, Xiaomi now being part of the kind of
you might have to prompt me to say more, but I could just kind of ramble through them, which is kind of fun. Alibaba, cloud focused, understands that open models can like enable more usage of platform. So I would say Alibaba is very, very cloud focused. ByteDance, mostly characterized by everybody else is intimidated by them and very user focused, including multimodal. Kimi, vibes of the office are great. It would be one of the best startup vibes that you would visit among like US or China. Jipu, very AGI pilled, surprisingly cautiously excited about being entity listed, even though they have no idea why they are, because they're like, it stamps them as a big deal. And then there's like
I
some
think because
like,
they previously worked with SOEs, that's like the main reason.
anyway.
Or they still do, but that was like one of their main sources of income. And unfortunately, because a lot of these labs spun out of Tsinghua, and Tsinghua is like, for people's context, it's like in Beijing, it's really close to the government. It's obviously, but the thing is, when it's close to government, it could mean like there's 3 layers of like agency underneath the actual government. But then people like to link it to the fact that then it's taking government money, so therefore they are suspicious. It's very unfortunate, I think, but a lot of companies get kind of thrown into that category. Even I think companies like Lenovo and a few other Chinese companies, they've previously been called out by US senators saying, oh, they're taking Chinese money, government money, but really that their scientists or their research labs spun out of a certain government affiliated or funded academic institution. That's what it is. But anyway, yes, go on.
Yeah. Some more would be like Xiaomi, like surprisingly great research vibes for a new team at like a random company. And it's like they seem to be crushing
What do you
it,
think
but
of
there's no like,
Locally?
I didn't get to meet her. I didn't get to meet
Okay.
her. I think it's like,
Okay. The star researcher.
I think that she's like as close to have as a star researcher right now. To like, there's the tier of like star CEO, which like there are obviously others, and like Dario and Sama, like the analogies are there. But the star researchers, like I don't know, the Sholtos of the world in the U.S. There's obviously you can come up with many more. Like she's like the closest you have to this, and I need to watch more interviews. I think that's like we'll see. But she wasn't at our meeting. But it's like they just seem to be doing the right thing, and they're making general models. They don't really have specialization yet. And it's like Florian, the person who helps me write about open models on Interconnects, and I like took a detour to go see Meituan because we're like, why is Meituan building these models? And they were very practical about it. It's like a less like we just met up with people. It wasn't an official visit for them. And it's like a less glamorous visit at normal tech office. And they're like, yeah, we're a major online platform. We obviously are going to use LLMs everywhere. We need to build our own LLM and specialize it to our products. Just like surprise, it's very practical minded, and I'm guessing there are many more companies in China like
That's what
this.
Tencent's
like,
saying too. It's like
yeah,
it's because they want to serve their existing consumers and like optimize their LLMs for their own distribution and their own like basic interface or their own, activity loop.
yeah. And like after I left, some people in the group went to like Xiaoheng Shu, like Red Note,
Yeah.
and they're there.
Yeah.
They've released some language
They're doing
models
it
that are like
too.
multimodal.
Yeah.
They're like multimodal data processing things. So like a lot of them are not that surprising. The startups just have different cultures. I think I have met some MiniMax people before, so I left the trip early before MiniMax on this one. But MiniMax was like quirky. They have a ton of women in their company, which is very fun. And they like have they have products. They're maybe slightly more product focused. But I feel like the quirkiness of the company kind of matches like maybe like from a Western confusion over what their products are doing and what they're trying to do. But it kind of like matches their language models that are a bit more efficient. And then, yeah, we met like
Well, they came out with a lot of very consumer focused applications, right? They had like Hilo and like Talkie, all these like character, like what are they called? Like companion bot like products before.
Yeah. And then the last one I went to was like Antling, which is also very corporate, but like in a less intense way, because I think they see it as serving their own products, where Alibaba Cloud is like, this is the gold mine, we have to win. It's like a much bigger game to them. It's like a much bigger deal for them than Ant Group. But it's like a lot of these things when you list them, I don't know, it's like maybe 8 to 10 companies. They're all pretty reasonable with respect to the age of the company and what the company does best.
Yeah.
There's like not
And
as
Anne
much
is like low key
confusion.
best at like medical chatbot right now. I guess like it made sense because everyone has access to Alipay, and then for seniors, it might be the only application they're using on a regular basis aside from WeChat. So like it became the default like medical consultation app, which is really random, but it's their niche now. Yeah, I think you're pretty spot on. It's pretty cool that you got those takeaways, even just meeting.
I mean, I've been reading about them for so long, so it's like a lot of these priors are like easy to confirm when they kind of fit with things you have seen. The Chinese showroom culture is so interesting, and also one of the most surprising things to have like
I love them.
Software companies. It is so funny, and like they're definitely appealing to Western audiences. Like Z.ai had poorly translated merch. It was, what was it? Something so.
I love some Chinglish
like
merch.
It would be like, it's like borderline inappropriate translation in the US. It was like ship big, go hard or something. Just like or something. It was like some really weird translations, and they have like live API statistics in their showroom. So Z.ai
Mhm.
was like, we're serving 5.5 trillion tokens a day, and all the US companies are so closely watched for when they announce token
Mm-mm.
statistics. So I think it's something like, I know at least one of these numbers is wrong. It's something like Fireworks does either 30 or 300 trillion tokens a day, and or I meant together for that one, and then one of the Fireworks and together, and other ones are like 100 trillion tokens a day. Don't take these as source. Go look them up. There were some public announcements recently, but like those were like the first updates that anyone has on like major infra companies in the US. That's like, yeah, like inference is a huge market. You don't hear anything from Fireworks because they're just struggling to meet demand, and they're making bank because inference is a much better um, thing to sell than bare metal. So essentially, inference is selling the software implementation to serve tokens more efficiently. And you could just get more margin when you improve the stack for a fixed model. So a model comes out and you host it, and then you can make your stack more and more efficient on that model. So you just get more margin and hopefully growing usage. And that's like way different than GPUs, which is the best case of GPUs is you just lock in a huge commitment for a long term. I think that's like all, and just being able to walk into an office and learn about their API is interesting because they also had distribution of geography, which is like China was, I don't know, like 2/3, US, say 20%. And then the last percent was like Singapore, Korea, Japan on the ZAI
Yeah.
API. So
Yeah.
like, that's cool. Like this is shit that I always want to know about the companies. And I have no idea. I think one of the things I always want to know is how are open models being used outside of US and China, and has this like decades long process of technological diffusion started to kick in a way that any company can measure. I don't think anyone has good data on it yet, but I think it's like obvious that at some point open models that are cheap to run are going to have some interesting playbook across the globe for less industrial, like the long tail of countries. And it's like, maybe I'll just walk into the front door of a Chinese open weight company and I'll get my answer.
No, but actually, I think the culture of these labs, a lot of them, because they're run by like really young, passionate people, you would feel like they're a lot less commercialized or less corporate-y, or at least less sleek. They're not sophisticated with, you can say they're not less sophisticated with, like, say, the capital market side of things, but you can also say that they're just really like naive and open-minded about and passionate about the product they're working on, less of like a corporate guardrail built around them.
Yeah, it's
Okay, I
like
want to
one of
talk
the
about,
people. Yeah, go ahead. It's like
yeah.
one of the people at ZA who's known on X as like, I don't know, like 9,000 followers. It's like Lou. It's like she came up and it's like, hi, I'm a student. I'm 20. I'm Lou from X. And I was like, it's hilarious. Like, it was like a lot of shit like that. It's like, oh, okay. It was like I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
want to
yeah. No,
call him a
and I
kid,
think
but it's like,
the one that runs like Moonshot's like developer ecosystem or something is literally a girl fresh out of school, right? And she just like posts hilarious memes all day long. There's like no filter on her social media. It's funny. Okay, we go on these tangents, Nathan. We need to come back on track. Open source, open weight. Why? Like, why do you think that Chinese labs are adopting it or embracing it, however you want to put it, especially after visiting them? Is it because they simply have to, because what we talked about, they are leaning on each other because of all the constraints they have? Or do you think the philosophical drive is actually bigger in that ecosystem? Or is this a bigger strategic thinking for diffusion in the long run?
I actually don't feel like it's that special ideologically. I think it's easy to say the ideological line when you're doing it. Now you can look at Zuckerberg. It's like he said the ideological line when he was doing it and then he stopped. And I think it's mostly just like, for one, distributing within the US ecosystem, especially to enterprises, is the highest value market. And they can't sign many enterprise deals. And the closest best thing is things like Cursor adopts Kimi's model. And even if Kimi doesn't get paid for that, they're happy. That's like the biggest sign of credibility for them, and figure it out in selling tokens or whatever in the future. So I think practically speaking, like one, the only way to influence the US market is by releasing these models. And then two, it's just like, it seems like they don't feel like they're losing as much if they release and share things. Like if the model was closed, they just think they would get less influence, they would be seen less people would use the model, their actual paid offerings would be adopted less. It just seems kind of like almost just like so overwhelmingly obvious, because there's all these benefits and not as obvious of a drawback, and there will always be better models, and just kind of keep going. But I think
And
every
why are
scientist
so many
loves.
US labs are against it? Like, or
because they
not
can
willing
make as
to.
much money without it. Like Anthropic and OpenAI make more money by not releasing them, and they could just make so much money that why bother thinking about an open model that doesn't make money? So there's just kind of like different scales of influence. And like same with Google. Like Google's making so much money. I think Meta will make a lot of money by having good AI models in their products. They get their act together. And it's like even Google could release more models. Like they have so many surfaces, like other than Gemini, that need AI to be commoditized and used, like the cloud and all of this. And like Meta could release their models. It's just not worth the effort for some of them. They're like, we need to do this such high revenue target that they're like, oh, it's too much of a pain to go through legal and make it ready to release. And like, why bother? I don't know. It's a little, maybe it's a little bit of a cynical take, but it's like I think Microsoft and Meta could release their best models openly because
It'll be
they
good for them.
benefit if it's a commodity layer, but I don't expect them to because it's just kind of like the benefits of focus are so high and they just kind of see it as something they don't have to do.
But then eventually, like, we will see some consolidation in the market as well, assuming, because you can't really have like 10 labs in each not dominant country right now to all
I do
exist.
expect consolidation. I think this is potentially a subtle cultural point, which is like the US labs are more likely to like buy into the we're special where we need to go fast to keep it closed, and the Chinese labs are not. Like there could be something there that's just who the decisions funnel up to as well. Like I don't know. I talked to the Alibaba people that make these decisions. I can't say all the things that they say about them. Like some of these were like 2-on-1 and off the record. It's like I can't say all these things. Like at all the other labs, there is a person that makes the call, I'm guessing. I don't expect, like, I think those are like senior leadership that we're not talking to. So it's kind of hard to know exactly what they really think. I think I definitely expect consolidation. My thing is that I expect it in China faster because the capital markets aren't as strong than as the US. But I don't have a model for that. I think you can model it, which is like, what do you think the revenue growths would be? What do they need to do to keep training bigger models? Like, what is the compute cost? And then which country do you think, like, you look at the potential raises and then think about which country would just not be able to do that raise first. But also it's like this wild thing with like OpenAI raised $120 billion. Are you kidding me? Like,
the valuation in the US is not really understandable by anyone else right now. I think in China, so on your point on that, I think I've been writing about this, and I think I don't know, it would make sense for like Tencent to just buy out one of the labs. Like they have the money, they need the capabilities, and frankly, they've really been struggling to compete with their LLMs. Like, all the
their
labs
licenses are so bad. They release all these models that have like horrible licenses. They're like not that good, and the licenses are just horrible.
So like, I feel like it financially makes sense for a company like that to optimize and just buy out a lab, and then the labs can then also lean in on their distribution, because at the end of the day, like, how are they going to win consumer mindshare or distribution in China right now when it's really just dominated by Alibaba, ByteDance, and Tencent? But that's my spiel. But when
I think
spoke
big
to
companies have a lot of inertia, and the senior leadership has the call, and they can have inertia. It's like I still think like Apple ending up just buying some lab for 25 to 50 billion. It's not the worst thing. Just golden handcuffs the researchers.
But I think right now
some
they don't
will
want
still
to. I
quit.
think the labs still have a dream. Some of the researchers still have a dream. So when I spoke to a few of them, they're like, no, we don't want to do that. We want to commit to our own frontier research. So if they say like, if I wanted to join one of the big tech, I could have. So why would I want to sell? So that's what the researchers think. But to your point, we don't know what actually the one person or two person at the very top think, especially if they continue to have, with compute access and capital access.
It also
which brings
depends
me to a
on
question.
Yeah, you can ask your next question. I don't need to cut you off. It's like it depends on your view of inference. It's like if these agents are just so much inference, I do think it's going to be an oligopoly, it's not monopoly style market. And what's the difference financially between 2 and 4 or 5 big companies with great models? Like, is that actually not sustainable if there's so much demand in like subtly different ways? Like, there's a lot of cases where we have 2 or 3, like the cloud or 2 or 3, but what's stopping that?
They
will
be the infrastructure
4?
providers. Yeah. And they would kind of lean into each of their existing ecosystems or distribution, whatever you want to call it, and serve certain specific models for specific use. So enterprises can choose what matches their needs the best as well. I can see that, yeah. I do want to bring the conversation to a more contentious topic, which is on distillation and model convergence. You raise a question of whether Chinese models are structurally different. And, often we are hearing claims saying a lot of these labs are about 3 to 6 months or 6 to 9 months behind US labs. There's obviously a lot of noise or allegations, accusations from certain US labs saying Chinese labs are distilling them. How do you actually see that accusation or that kind of dynamic?
The biggest unknown that I don't have an answer to, which actually has a lot of sway, is like how much of the Chinese companies actively trying to hack APIs versus just show up as a customer and pay. And like if they're like when if you're trying to hack the APIs, normally get like reasoning traces out so that you can create a reasoning foundation that would be similar to the model that you're trying to do this from, which is very different than the API standard form, which is just like the output of the model, which is a very different, less direct process from learning from. I don't know the magnitudes. So if it's more just like I just walk up to Anthropic API and I use it as intended, but I'm making a competitive model, like I'm not very sympathetic to Anthropic. They could ban it if they want to. And I think the impacts are like, it's just kind of a standard practice. You can do it with many different models and so on. It's like, if there really are like the evidence Anthropic provided is not large enough scale where I'm like, this is a industry like IP theft at mass scale going on 24/7, 365. And it's like, so there's definitely some gray area to it on the like
Yeah.
what is actually happening in distillation. So that's why I've like on a policy side want to push people for don't call all of it the same thing. So like essentially using any API endpoint to make synthetic data to train your model is some form of distillation. But it's very different if you're like, we're trying to break this model so that it gives us a different behavior that is hyper useful for training and not get caught. Like those are pretty different actions, and they're all looped into this common phrase of distillation right now. And I think that's my biggest problem, which is like academic researchers and small companies use distillation extensively as like the core of their business and the core of their research method. So it's like if the US government nukes that as a thing that could be done in the AI ecosystem, it's mostly bad for small players and bad for US China tensions and bad for academics. So that's my primary concern. And then trying to get the labs to actually say more. This is the distillation side. And then performance is the other side, which on benchmarks, it does seem like the Chinese labs tend to be the 6 to 9 months behind. And I think that when it comes to general use, I've always found the closed models to be better in kind of ways that are hard to measure. So I go very back and forth on whether or not the closed models are better. I think we will especially see Anthropic and OpenAI pull ahead on knowledge work tasks like legal, healthcare, financial services, because I just don't see the Chinese labs paying for that data. Because all that data is going to be people that charge hundreds of dollars an hour to like annotate and create these environments. So it's just a whole new capital build out that goes on there right now. And I think it's like, if it's going to be billions of dollars, if you're going to buy $1 billion of data and $1 billion of compute and $1 billion of talent to train your model,
They don't
like
have the
that's just
money.
kind of like, I don't think they have that. So like Merker has some of these evals, and I think there is a bigger gap there. So it's so hard. I think this is like, it's a very interesting question. And again, it's like Florian, this guy that helps me, we disagree on it. And it's like in this fine line between, yes, the evals like coding and lots of these things, and like even random evals that surely the Chinese labs aren't training on. Like the open models really are genuinely crazy impressive scores. So I think there's also a tester's bias where it's like, I don't use the open models as much. And it's like, maybe it's hard to ground in my head like what I was doing with AI 6 to 9 months ago. Like I wasn't even using Claude code as
Right.
extensively. So it's like,
Right.
I guess the question is like at the
The
end of
cowork
this
wasn't even
year,
out yet. Yeah.
at the end of this year, can I use an open model in something like Claude Code and feel like it works at all? Like I guess that's the test on the performance gap. Start in June to
Yeah.
August, and whether or not that hits like that. I don't think that the open models have hit that yet. I think it would be way more of a narrative if all the companies spending billions of dollars on Claude were like, oh, we can spend 1% and just use DeepSeek. Like these CIOs at all the big companies that are like, some companies spend more on tokens for the employees than on headcount. These are normally startups, but like they would happily reduce that token cost to 1% expenditure if it really was that similar. because then you could just use like 10x the tokens. But I don't expect that to happen, and I expect the things like the latest Claude and GPT 5.5, like I expect more of these things through the year, which we'll see if I ended up being right. It's these both are right at the middle of us as a world getting more clarity on them, and they're like 18-month long stories unfolding, and I feel like we're just in the middle of performance gap and distillation and learning more.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think you mentioned, like, help me recall conversation I had with other people as well. Like, the point on distillation is that I just had a conversation with your former colleague at he used to lead APAC Hugging Face called Wang Tiejin. And he was just saying, look, the distillation accusations don't really make sense because we're all distilling off of each other as we speak. Even like, I'm learning from you, you learn from me, like we're distilling. And like it's so vague of a terminology to just like use that to kind of accuse of all these various behaviors. So to your point, I think people in the technical world who understand what's happening actually want more clarity on what is the gray area, what is actually black and white, and not appropriate or unethical. And that needs, I think, the industry to come together to really put together guardrails and rules. Now that's on that. Now number two, on the compute side and the data side, I think something anecdotally will be interesting to you is that when I spoke to one of the lab researchers in Beijing, I think in February around Chinese New Year, they were saying, look, like they want to get better data, but they can't, because usually like a lot of American labs would pay say like tens of millions, if not even more, like $100 million for like a set of like very obscure or like niche data set, but they would have exclusivity contract. And then like what the Chinese labs will do is that like they would literally wait out the exclusivity contract and then like say 2-3 months later pay it for like 1/10 or 1/20th of the price for that same data set. So then once they start post training on that data set, that's where the 3 to 6 months or 6 to 9 months come in as well. Yeah. On
Yeah,
that
I
note,
think the data industry in the US has two things. One, the lab asks the data vendor, we need this specific type of
yeah.
data. And the data vendor is a network that connects the people to the lab. And the other thing is the data vendors know evals that are important. So they try to create good data for hill climbing on specific evals. That data could be sold to multiple people, but is less expensive because they make it once and expect to eat margin or take margin on it. And so I think it's like, but it's like there could be a pipeline where once OpenAI is at the cutting edge, creates this new thing, they create deep research, and the data industry is like, oh, let's make things that are a little bit cheaper to sell. So there's time lag in these various things. But yeah, I heard the same thing on the ground where it's like they have all negative impact or influence of the data industry. It's like quality is bad. We don't really have access. We do some in-house. That's a very big difference than today, which is like you have the American data in the US, which is insane.
Data companies are so mature. Yeah, it's like its own sophisticated like ecosystem. Before we get into data, I actually want to ask you this question. I think recently a lot of the narrative is now saying, look, Anthropic and OpenAI have kind of proven that pre-training scaling laws continue to hold, especially with the recent models. There's an obvious compute constraint on the China side that we talked about, and then it will likely be more even amplified with absence of Blackwells, in the coming months. So as we move forward in this race per se, if you have to kind of put it in China versus US in that sense, will we see a wider gap between the performance and benchmarks between the Chinese labs and US labs, as in we will see the gap going to 12 months, 24 months, as Chinese labs are very, very constrained on compute for pre-training breakthroughs?
I think it's more of like pre-training as a thing that you could actually finish. How big can you pre-train a model that you can finish and serve? So I think like the Chinese labs could train models that look like 4.5, which is this giant model, but you can't serve it, which would be like they end up training a model that is 2.5 trillion parameters and they release it, and like not many people, like no one can use it. They can barely serve it on their API because they don't have like whatever, like Blackwell and like VL72 racks or something, like these racks that are like what are serving these large MOE models. Like they just don't have quantity of these to have them. So there's like a difference between models that you can build and models that are actually useful. And I think some of the Chinese labs are definitely like, we don't need to release the gigantic models because nobody is going to use them. And open weight, like the biggest models end up getting served via API. So there might be some segmentation in that market. But I do think that this is like, I think that like inference and amount of economic resources that you have to serve your customers is like becoming a thing that dictates what models are built. And I think that's why I think the gap will continue to rise. It's like all signs point to GPT 5.5 being a bigger model. And I don't expect that to stop. And then the economics of it is just the basics of you need a certain volume to have the margin to support the research, because you can't keep raising these ridiculous rounds forever. And I think OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google are the only people with that AI usage volume to keep marching down the scaling laws to, say, another like 10x of training compute, which is just mind-boggling amounts of investment in a model. So that's why I'm like, it's gonna show up in when the economic market's slow for fundraising, the models gap between these big three will just show a lot more. So that's that. I guess that's the distilled way to say my prediction of like when the things will look different. It's like these labs can't fundraise, they go public, they can't generate revenue more on their paid services. And then it's just like, look at how much training compute can be allocated or can't be allocated.
Yeah.
So I think I agree with what you said.
Basically, yeah, we'll see a bigger gap, we think, in the coming months. Then what can make up for that? Like domestic chips, or like you said, better data? And why is it that I think sometimes people assume China has a very strong data ecosystem or data products, but actually the data vendor ecosystem is very weak in China?
I don't know on the data side, but the way that domestic chips could help is that if Huawei chips, they are fine for inference, and if they have sufficient volume to support the inference economics, which then trickles back into revenue. My read is that they just don't have the volume of the chips, especially spread out across the amount of companies that they have. Like, so essentially like the total flops of Huawei is all the things produced, and it's going to all these different places. It's just not big enough. It could be something like the likes of ByteDance and Alibaba with like offshore data centers can keep up a lot longer, because they have access to like Nvidia compute and have for a long time through this kind of offshoring. And maybe that stabilizes the ecosystem, and we'll see what the like AI startup, the younger startups like Kimi and Z.ai end up doing. Because if it's like no one wants to do this, but if they pool resources, they last an extra year. You get another order of magnitude if they all pool together, but I don't see them doing it.
But that's the thing what we're just talking about, right? Like MiniMax and GPU, how can they possibly compete with the hyperscale at this point if you need offshore data centers? And like the fact that GPU is on the entity list doesn't help, right? Like it's not going to be easy for them to access.
I think they can't. I think they won't. I think human nature will make it so they won't collaborate. They'll just do something smaller. They'll just like have successful businesses that are different.
They just
rather than
smaller ambitions, want a smaller piece of the pie. Yeah. Okay. So you wrote something like, nothing a secret, but everyone wants Nvidia chips. They want it.
Yeah.
They don't know how to get
They're
it.
the only thing that works for training. All the models are trained on Nvidia. I don't believe the DeepSeek propaganda that it's trained on Huawei. The only models that are trained on Huawei
I think they
are
claim
like
that it was inference on Huawei.
Yeah,
not trained,
inference
right?
on Huawei works. Every lab is like inference on Huawei works. The labs that don't have meaningful inference are like, we are told to get Huawei, so we buy them, but we don't use them. Which is like earlier research labs are like, we don't have any inference, so we don't have a need for Huawei. Any company that has meaningful use of their models has figured out how to run them on Huawei for inference. Which, to Jensen's credit, is like it's not like it's happening. What he said was going to happen, but it's
the
not
DoorDash
that surprising.
Interview.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, I don't actually understand why he got so much hate for it, because even without, your political stance, it's like what he said actually made sense logically by saying if you don't sell them the kind of crappier versions of what we have, they will have a equally crappy version.
I think they would buy both.
Right?
I think buying both is actually true. Like the amount of Nvidia chips that you would have to sell to China for them to stop buying Nvidia or stop buying Huawei, because Huawei is almost surely way cheaper, because Nvidia margins are insane. So it's like, when would they actually stop buying?
But then you have to go on CAN. You have to rewrite everything back on CAN. You have to, the developer ecosystem's not there, that's Jensen's point, right? Or the habits are not there. So I think
But I'm saying they would also use Huawei. I think they are so supply limited, they would use both. I mean, like Anthropic uses everything. Like a lot of companies in the US will use multi-platform. Like Meta is a huge buyer of AMD. Like it's just like demand is so high that any chip that is potentially viable on the models within a few generations is very valuable. And the fact that you can run some reasonably large model on any Huawei chip is a big line cross for Huawei. I don't know if they could produce the volume of chips and scale that quickly, especially as they try to move to lower nodes. That's like the standard semi debate, but that's like the question is like, can Huawei scale production? That I think that's like the only question. And if Huawei could manage to scale production, like Jensen will just look really right. And if Huawei can't scale production, Jensen will look a little bit like a lunatic, but it'll be outside of his hands.
And we don't really know what happened during this trip. It seemed like nothing really substantial really happened after this big Trump delegation.
It seems like
It was
nothing
more
happened.
like a high profile, like tourism trip versus like an actual deal trip. Okay, I want to ask you on something you wrote about a bit niche, like not something you usually write about. It's on the SaaS side of things. But you said that okay, so there's a common argument that China struggled to monetize AI because they're unwilling to pay for enterprise software. We looked looked at how China tries to monetize on consumer AI, but clearly that's not really been proven yet. In your piece, you push back on the claim and say that, there's a distinction between SaaS spend and cloud or inference spend. Tell us about what you think about that kind of ecosystem and how Chinese AI labs are trying to make money, maybe a bit differently from American AI labs.
I don't know if it's necessarily different, but I ask a lot of researchers about this, and they say that like everybody is trying the new AI tools when they come out, and if they don't like them, they stop using them. If they like them, they keep using them on like the consumer side. So something like OpenClaw would be an example. Like tons of people tried it. I'm guessing lots of them turn in China, just like in the US, but like the consumers are very quick to adopt and try new things, but won't stick if it's not actually serving them. And then the enterprise is like, there's definitely cloud that exists, like digital services are gigantic, and they're essentially think that there's more runway for making money on AI models that falls into that. And like they all use coding agents, they all use Claude. It's a hilarious thing. They're all like very Claude pilled. There's like almost no mention of Codex, where in the Western media, Claude versus Codex is this whole thing. Like they all use Claude, and that is obviously a paid service. So it's like I think there's some things like that I think there's like cracks in the argument, and that I expect AI models to be seen as like a bit of cloud, but potentially that like it is the thing that changes some of the expectations, where it's just so transformative because they're so competitive, and that it like could be seen as a bit of a phase shift.
Yeah, and I think it's a generational phase shift, but also actually recently Dobal raised their like prices on I think C-Dance usage and whatnot, and it's like a shift into trying to capture the prosumer market. You can say the average like uncle auntie maybe on the street still don't want to pay for an app, for a consumer app, but like I think there's more prosumer like market share that could be captured in China, maybe not fully enterprise either. I want to ask you about government roles and geopolitics. I know there is a common narrative that usually people assume Chinese AI labs are heavily subsidized. Actually, when I was in San Fran in March, I was at a dinner with a couple investors, mostly public investors, and one guy asked me, he said, "Hey, like, are all labs just basically subsidized by the government?" I was like, "Oh, like, definitely not. Majority of them are not. If not, they frankly don't want to take money from the government." And it was really like hard for him to understand that, because I think the misconception is all Chinese labs or Chinese tech are just funded by the government. Kind of to our point earlier, where like any affiliation to any government agency just by default is assumed to be therefore backed. First of all, the government, I don't even know if they have that much money to give out. Number two, I don't think that's how like competition works, right? So what's your thought on all of this?
It seemed more like a provincial government trying to help the companies do stuff, which is like get offices, get talent. I don't know what the provincial government can do. Like in Beijing, there's Beijing Academy for AI or whatever, which is like a real research institute that's just funded by a certain neighborhood in Beijing. I was like, oh, okay, like the US could do that, but much less of like the ant group style thing, which is government takes major ownership stake in investment round and go on. I think like maybe Kimi's latest round, there was mentions of like government backed VCs, and I don't know how that kind of intermediary works. So I still think it's very indirect. And because the government system is so competitive across the different layers, like each of those layers are competing to help the companies, but they don't have piles of cash sitting around to like buy GPUs. And it's like I think
No, they don't.
I
And they don't frankly know
knew
what they're doing, I think, half the time. I think this is
yeah
an
I
argument. Like these, like what you said, like Haidian district or Chaoyang district of Beijing will be funding an academy, and the academy will be in the effort to help so-called like AG go towards AGI. But the reality is they're trying to follow this high level KPI of being like, oh, let's make AI happen, and all they want to do is write in their report and say we funded something about AI, so we've like hit our quota. I don't think it's as like hands-on as people assume
if you
how a
read
lot of this
Breakneck,
comes around.
most of US tech people haven't read Apple and China and Breakneck. And all you need
Both
to
great
do is
books.
read these books and learn a little bit about the interface between tech and China and understand that they are also hyped about AI. And then you'll like kind of understand that it's like a messy trickle down process in like, the Chinese government. It would be very obvious if they were like nationalizing a lab. It would be as obvious as if it was in the US. Like does not happen.
Yeah. So to close, what is the biggest disconnect between how the US I guess, AI ecosystem right now, think of China, a Chinese AI, and what you saw on the ground? And what is something you think we didn't touch on today that you want to share?
This is the thing that everybody asks me. They normally ask me the first thing I get off the plane is like, what's the big thing? And it's like, I don't think there's anything that shocking. I think that many people just like haven't read basic books about how tech is interfaced with the government and know these things, or hear narratives that are very geopolitical, which is like targeting the top end of the government system and how that in US engages. And it's like there's a lot of shrapnel from that, I think. I mean, like Anthropic pushes very aggressive Chinese narratives, and Anthropic is a very followed company in tech. And it's just like most people don't spend the time on this in the US ecosystem and just don't go deep on it. And I think that's like, so it's like I don't have anything shocking. It's just like a good to encourage people to do some of that, because these dynamics impact things. Like the Chinese open models are really influential in how Silicon Valley is building AI. So like it matters to a lot of people, but they don't do the like they don't study the causes of what like why they might do this. They just are like, oh, it's here. I don't need to think about China.
Yeah, and I think I don't know what it is. So like even Bill Gurley was saying, a couple of his public appearances saying like it seems like Chinese researchers, tech people, CEOs, whoever, are a lot more aware or following more closely of like US leaders and thought leaders, tech leaders, whatnot, business leaders than vice versa. And there's something about that. I don't know if it's just like, it's easier to dismiss it or easier to like not have to learn something new. But,
I think it's American culture. American culture is like very obsessed
as a Canadian,
with its own
I can't say
world.
things like that. You said it.
Yeah, it's hilarious. American culture is ridiculous. It's so ridiculous.
But I think, look, a shameless self-plug in here, like as a Chinese Canadian, my life goal here, like with AI Proem, it's really just to bridge that gap. At the end of the day, I think to your point, like there's going to be geopolitical narratives and rhetorics at the very top, but for the average person or even for just like builders, tech people, whatnot, it's probably in everyone's benefit to understand what's happening on the other side and stop alienating it or stop making it as if it's so different. Because I think throughout conversation, it's really just to say, like, look, so much of it is so similar, but so much of it is slightly different. But the difference is not really a government mandate versus like maybe a cultural difference or like a resource constraint difference, especially in building technology. But that's kind of my view. One last question for you, which is a question I ask everyone on the show. What is one differentiated view you hold? Throw me something crazy.
I don't know. I've always kind of an open models doomer, even though I build on them. I just think that it's like so unsustainable, and there's so much money to be made with building closed software that I'm constantly doomy about the prospects of open models. It's like,
a bit sad,
I'm always a skeptic. Yeah.
How does a company like Hugging Face actually make money?
I don't know. You can look into how much money they actually make. It's not very much, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's the unfortunate reality of like, the capitalist society we live in. As much as it incentivizes the competition and breakthroughs, it doesn't help with what we just talked about earlier. All right, Nathan, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your insights and your sharing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Thank you for listening to AI Proem's Differentiated Understanding. This is your host, Grace Xiao. If you enjoyed the episode, please give it a follow and a thumbs up on Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you next time.